Good evening. I'm Jennifer Laursen, President of Friends of Chamber Music. And on behalf of Friends of Chamber Music, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's performance in context conversation with the amazing Merz Trio. We have with us Dionne, pianist with Merz Trio, violinist Brigid Coleridge, and cellist Julia Yang. The Merz are winners of many, many competitions. I saw them when they won the Fischoff Competition in 2019 and began plotting to get them to a series near me at that very time. And since then, they have won a recent Naumburg Prize for Chamber Music, which is really prestigious if you know anything about that prize. Formerly, they were the ensemble in residence at New England Conservatory's professional piano trio program, and since that time, they've been based out of Boston. The Merz Trio will be performing on Saturday at 7:30 in Page Hall on the downtown campus of the University at Albany. They'll be playing a program that will include the piano trio in D minor by Gabriel Fauré, Tchaikovsky's piano trio in A minor, and all of this will be set amongst a variety of shorter works ranging from Gesualdo to Strauss, all arranged by the Merz Trio. Tickets are available at the door for $35. It's free for students, or you can purchase them online at our website. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome the Merz Trio, Dionne, Brigid Coleridge, and Julia Yang. So thank you for joining me tonight. A note to those of you who are in the audience, we have Shay Gauthier behind the scenes, and she will be monitoring your questions as they come in the chat box and bringing them to my attention, and I'll insert them in the conversation as I can. So first of all, I want to know about your name, Merz Trio. What does it refer to? How did you come up with that name? Yeah, go ahead, Lee.
So we came up with the name, I think, in maybe our first few weeks together as a trio, and we'd been playing together a bit. We actually were really cramming in our first 2 weeks. We put together a couple of recordings to send to different competitions, and so we thought, well, we need a name, and we wanted to avoid something that sounded like a constellation or a gelato flavor, and we did a bunch of research, also based around what we really cared about and valued as a group. So one of the things that we were all really interested in from the beginning was this question of expanding or interrogating the concert experience. How do we make that something that is more welcoming or has more entry points to people coming from all sorts of backgrounds, from different disciplines? And we settled on Merz, or Merz, which is a term that was coined by the German visual artist Kurt Schwitters in the early 20th century. And he kind of arrived at this style originally based on found object collage between the two wars. So it was his kind of response to Dada, his way of making sense of this world that had broken apart. But then he was also very active in a number of different disciplines. He wrote the first text piece called the Ursonata, which is just like a spoken piece in sonata form. He like completely decorated his parents' house in Hanover with artwork, and he always said that art is where people are and where connections are made. And so this is kind of what we took from him. And so a lot of our projects also bring in different art forms, and it's about music speaking to other things. And so it's a very long explanation, sorry, but that is where Merz comes from.
It really is a great name, for sure. Really. I want to know how you formed as a trio. Did you know each other previously? Had you always been a trio fan, or was this something novel for you?
Let's see. Well, I think, the field of chamber music is very specific, and it's a very specific line of work, what you're sort of choosing to partake in and on a daily basis, working so closely with 2 or 3 or 4 other members, and really making that such a huge part of your life and sharing in that sort of life. And I think before I had met Lee and Bridge, I had sort of this vision of wanting to form a quartet, as many young string players have. And so I was doing a bunch of reading with a number of people and had just moved to New York at this point. And lo and behold, I meet Lee in Carnegie Hall's Ensemble Connect. It's a fellowship for young professionals. It's chamber music, educational fellowship, and we played some piano quartets together. And Lee told me he knew of this wonderful violinist who he had met at Yellow Barn a number of summers prior. And so we met one day in the wing of Carnegie, and it was a snowstorm, and we were all sort of flurried, and we played some Beethoven Opus 1, number 1. And I think actually that was just the moment where, at least for me, and I think for all of us, we felt that there was this connection immediately, and that's how it got started.
That was going to be my next question. You know, when did you know that you were a group that had potential, a group that you wanted to stick with, and how did you? What was it that you felt that was different from other ensembles you'd been with?
I think that Julia's right that it's important that you feel that connection. That's the thing that sparks your interest and makes you want to continue to explore. And I certainly think that one thing that really appealed to all of us was the sense of humor that was there. It felt quite, there could be a lot of lighthearted moments, and I think that that's a quality that we all really value, both in our rehearsal space, but also seeking that in the music. I mean, a lot of the music is about more than a sense of fun, but I think often a sense of fun can be lost along the way, that classical music is often viewed as something extremely serious, but I think it's often about composers speaking to the idea of a whole life, and I hope that everybody's lives include a bit of fun. So that was definitely an element that was there, but I think also it's important to state that it's not easy putting together 3 individuals who have strong opinions and who've come from very different backgrounds, both educationally and culturally and musically even. And so that first year also contained a lot of low moments for all of us. And it was really a question of perseverance and believing that something could be made if we just held on and trusted and put in the work.
Trust has to be a really big part of it, doesn't it? Because you've got to trust that they're going to hang in there with you too. That you're not going to then have to replace the cellist or the whatever. So you really have to feel that everyone's being honest, I suppose, in their and sincere in their wanting to make it. One thing I noticed, I'm just going to put this out there. One thing I noticed about you all when I saw you at the Fischoff Competition was I had this feeling that you were in love with each other's sound. Like it was like you put each other under a spell. And that's something that is very appealing to me as an audience member when I can sense that one member is anticipating the next and can't wait to hear what is going to come and feels moved by what the next person is doing. And not all groups feel that way. It's pretty extraordinary. I can only think of a handful. So that's something that stuck with me from the time I first saw you.
I think, speaking to that, I think we owe a lot to our mentors at NEC in particular. They're all about taking each other's parts along with us, or having this sort of, I can't remember what is Mary's term, what sort of empathy?
She's a couple things.
She has like this
talks about gathering things in like the bass line of the cello, but
it's some sort of like extreme empathy that you are supposed to have towards your neighbor and the other person that you're playing with. And then also this idea of sending your sound out to this core, that you're all sort of gathering your sound to like the center and then sending it out to the hall. So these are some things that helped us on the way, I think.
I think speaking of trust, also it's interesting with the piano trio because it's kind of counterintuitive. You would think with, uh, I guess, like, because the piano is always this variable and the piano is different in every hall, it's not even just that the hall is different, it's really the actual sound that you have as a group might be different. And so I think counterintuitively, as opposed to like a string quartet, it's maybe even more important to have a kind of group imagination around the sound and in how to make it sound still like yourselves, even when it might be very different on a given day.
Yeah, that was going to be a question of mine down the line, but this is a really good spot to talk about it. When you play as string players with a piano, what do you have to do differently than you would in a string quartet, for instance? And as a pianist who maybe plays solo or as a duo, what do you have to do differently when you're working with two others? Are you listening differently? How are you finding a balance?
I think as a string player, a couple things shift. Notably, often articulation is one thing that you're always listening for because of the way that the piano begins notes. And of course, Lee and wonderful pianists out there have millions of different types of articulation. But I think string players don't generally have the same overlapping set, or you have to be very thoughtful about having those articulations make sense with when you see a tenuto or when you're interpreting a staccato note or whatnot. So articulation is one big part of that. And for the cello in particular, I find when I play with pianos and in piano trio as opposed to with just another string player, that I'm actually putting a lot more articulation generally to the front of the note. There's sometimes I don't think quite as much about the sustain because there's so much pedal often, or there's more bloom in the piano sound. And so as a cellist in a string quartet, you have to sort of provide that bass all the time and provide that sound structure. But in a piano trio, you're actually sometimes just wanting to get your melody out or whatnot. And so it's a lot more articulation, I think.
Yeah, and another thing that unfortunately we have to deal with is intonation, because I think that perhaps there's a little bit more flexibility when you play in a string quartet. You can make a lot of choices to do with intonation, about how you're hearing harmony and what you're privileging in that kind of harmonic structure, and then how that pertains to your intonation. Whereas in a piano trio, you have the fixed pitches of the piano there, and so there's less room for interpretative intonation. Um, I think that the other thing that is just strikingly different about being a string player playing in a piano trio is the way that the writing for this genre asks you to behave differently a lot of the time. So it's this really interesting meeting point, if you like, between the kind of ensemble playing that you might associate with a string quartet, which is so in tune with one another and with the composite, but then you also have these real moments because you're only one instrument inhabiting your role, and that's really vital then, that you really step up to the plate at many times. And so for a cellist, they're going to have a lot more soloist ick moments than they would have in a string quartet. A violin is being asked to really, really project. Both the cello and the violin are competing against this generally 9 foot, concert grand. And so there are all sorts of different ways that you have to really know what function you're performing at any given time. Are you being asked to be a soloist? Are you being asked to be, a supportive voice? What is your relationship with the piano?
Mm-hmm. And I suppose the pianist has to be way more sensitive to volume. Um,
Sorry, not finding my mute button. Um, yeah, it's really interesting. I feel like playing in a piano trio has been so wonderful for me as a pianist. I mean, it really expands, as Julia was saying, your repertoire of articulations, sounds like things you need to have in your toolbox. I think also with piano, it's a percussive instrument. So with solo playing, especially a lot of very impressive, brilliant piano playing tends towards a kind of, lightning-like brilliance, which also has a lot to do with how you feel the rhythm, because the attacks are always right there. So the rhythm can often be very like front-loaded, which completely doesn't work with string players, which are much closer to voice. Like there always needs to be breath and room in what you're doing. And you kind of learn through trio playing, I think that like the most effective ways to be expressive are to find resonance rather than power. So to your point about dynamics, it's actually less about volume control. You can play much louder, but more resonantly in a way that leaves space for the strings. And you can also find ways of pulling back and being more expansive with timing that give the illusion of something that's much more powerful, rather than just playing with a direct sound that might be right there, but kind of doesn't have the same heft to it, that sort of thing.
Hmm. Well, this gives us something to listen for when we hear you on Saturday. For sure. Um, so I think it's really fascinating how you incorporate literature into your programs, particularly your CD Ink, which I listened to several times over the past couple of days, and I absolutely love this CD. Um, so I wanted to find out how you began to experiment with this way of making an immersive presentation. Um,
Well, all of our best work is done last minute. So one thing is that ink came together, I think, about 3 weeks before. But do one of you want to talk about the process a little bit more of putting that together? It was in October 2020, I think, right? So we were kind of in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah, well, it's funny because we had planned almost a year in advance that we were going to record an album. And so we had booked a recording, a recording engineer who we loved working with. And we had a Haydn trio, a Ravel trio, and another piece by Johannes Maria Staud that we were very excited about to record. And that was sort of in our minds as like our first CD together. And then the pandemic happened, and we actually weren't able to play together for close to 6 months. And so we were rethinking a lot of things, as many people were during that time. And one of the things that we radically changed was this album. And we all decided that we still wanted to work with the Ravel trio, that we loved this trio and that it would perhaps be the centerpiece of our first album. But how could we explore this trio that's been recorded so many times in a way that that shed light on it, I guess, in a new way, that you could hear it in a context that perhaps was more like the context that it was written in. And of course, so then I guess we delved into researching various parts, researching, of course, Ravel's life and the composers around him during that time. I think Brigid in particular got excited about all the writers during the time. And so even like the opening, for instance, it was just a reference in this book by Ravel, that Ravel had this record by Vincent Scotto in his collection. And so I think I was like starting to research other records by Vincent Scott, like what did he write? And then we found this Josephine Baker song that of course is so popular and has been arranged 50 different times, but never by piano trio. We're like, let's put this on the album. And so it sort of just grew out of that and grew out of the research.
Well, and it's like, as Julia's saying, there's so much, once you start doing the research, there's so much that's available. And this was also coming off of summer 2020. And, we were out protesting Black Lives Matter and like thinking about our classical music world also in this question of like, who's represented in this world and like who has a place, who has a voice, like what kind of world do we want to represent in this album? And I think we were all super interested in the world that Ravel's trio was written in, not just like the world historically that is memorialized in the musical canon, but actually like the other composers that maybe none of us have heard of, but that Ravel would have known and that would have influenced his work.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing that became important when we thought more about the context in which it was written was it was written in 1914, and 1914 is the year that the First World War began. So um, yeah, I know that for me that became kind of a poignant fact to think about, because a pandemic is not a war, but it meant something that Ravel was writing this piece, and he knew what it was to have your entire lives change in a very short space of time. And for a lot of the writers who we ended up including on the album, for many of them, you know, they went off to war and they never came back, or they went off to war, or had an experience during that time and their careers never returned, or their lives looked radically different afterwards. And so that was
It's
an interesting thing to think about and to explore in a moment in which we were all having, you know, very smaller but experiences that spoke to the same idea. And it was also important for us. A number of women are included on the album, and you know, as a trio who's 2/3 female, that felt important, and that became really actually quite energizing, because these women had completely like really quite radical lives in a way, and those are just not the kinds of stories that you ever learn in a music history course, or when people speak about classical music they don't often reference those kinds of stories. So it became important that lots of different voices were included, not just from a representational point of view, but because this was a reality. And that's important to us, because in our own music making we bring our realities like into our rehearsal spaces, into how we play, how we perform. They're an inevitable part of the music, you know, as the audience hears it. So yeah, it felt true to the way that we make music to think about Ravel's trio in that way.
And it feels really organic to listen to it. It really feels like you have been brought into this world of Ravel. It's really pretty incredible. I have to say, and not um, it's not gimmicky. These sorts of things could go that way, right? But this feels so organic. I
we also had a very good audio engineer because, as you can imagine, the pandemic, we ended up recording all of the speaking in my living room. And then we recorded the music in a professional studio. And so we had somebody who was able to make that sound like the same space.
Oh, that's the other thing I noticed about it. Your speaking voices are just beautiful. I mean, you use your voices like you use your instruments, and it's really very wonderful. You probably had to work on that aspect of it a lot, I imagine.
Thanks to Brigid's coaching, who is also an actress here.
Yeah, really, wonderful, wonderful voices from all of you when you when you speak during that album. And as I understand it, at least two of you, maybe all three of you, have literature backgrounds in one way or another, and that probably led you down this road in some form. Am I right?
Yeah, yeah, Lee and I have both have literature degrees. Yeah, and I mean that was really a part of it. I mean, when you say it's not gimmicky, I mean that's also really important to us. So in all of this work that we do, that involves other elements, I think that it's really easy for it to feel gimmicky, especially now that everybody is sort of, you know, trying to pair their music with beer and all this sort of stuff. But I think that for us it was important right from the beginning to include that kind of thing, because that's a part of our lives. And that's a part of, I know that for me, I really had been wanting for a long time to find a context in which I could bring those other interests, those non-musical interests, into a more overt performance space, because they were already there, again, as part of, you know, how I think about playing or how I approach my music making, just because they're a part of me. And yeah, I thought that that would be such an interesting idea. It's like an extra way of exposing process to an audience, to say that, listen, this is also part of how we think about what we do and how we relate to one another and how we make sense of things. So yeah, and all sorts of influences have been uncovered then amongst the three of us, all sorts of other interests too. So it's an ongoing process.
So do you have other projects like this in mind? What might be down the road for you that you're percolating on at the moment?
It's funny because we I don't think we have another album planned just yet. We have a number of ideas for that, but Um, it seems like a lot of our projects this year are shaping up to be movement based. Like we just had a residency at Yellow Barn working with a wonderful mime and director. We put together like a 45-minute show. That was so exciting for us because we're always thinking as a piano trio, like how do we get up out of our seats? You know, like the piano is this fixed piece of furniture, and like how do we really do something that is integrated and theatrical on stage that involves a little bit more than us just playing. And she was so wonderful in finding kind of solutions around that and creating this kind of movement-based narrative. But then coming up, we also have a project called Undiluted Days, which is actually a very similar program to the one we'll be playing this weekend. And we're working with another director in New York and Boston, and that's also shaping up to include some movement in his latest idea, which is kind of interesting. But it's fun to work with collaborators because they bring a lot and a lot of imagination and creativity, and then it's not all just on you to come up with everything.
I can imagine just that extra little seed of an idea can be stimulating. Um, so I love the period around Ravel and the period between the wars, and it's maybe my favorite musical period. I'm wondering about you all. Who are your favorite composers? What historical period are you most interested in, or maybe you're more of a generalist. I don't know.
I'm just going to answer really quickly for my part, sorry, but just to say I also love that period. And we do a lot of arranging, which also lets us feel like we have access to, a lot more music than we would with the trio. But right now I'm in the middle of arranging Ravel La Valse. And a lot of our arrangements are also from kind of Berg and Mahler and that sort of time.
So
Julia, I'm waiting for you to say something. A little bit like being asked what your favorite book is.
you're still thinking.
No, I mean, I feel as though there's something to enjoy about every period, and that's what's really wonderful about putting together programs like we have been, which really mix, 300, 400 years of music, because then you find all these connections between completely disparate periods, and that feels very exciting as a musician, and it informs the ways that you play in really unexpected ways. But I will say, just because I'm thinking about this program that we're playing on the weekend, I have a real soft spot for a lot of Baroque music. I love the way I have a bit of a background from Irish music. That was how I began with violin playing, and that's sort of my comfort place, I think, in some ways, within the classical music sphere, because that feels the closest to dancing, like the dance music that I'm used to. So yeah, I'll say that for the moment, because we have a little piece from the Baroque period this weekend.
I think for me, I don't necessarily narrow it down to a period, but I think I tend to be drawn to music that is very visceral in nature, and that can be expressed in a lot of different ways. So of course, like the Romantic period and just feeling like this emotion on your sleeve and Brahms and whatnot, and this sense of longing that's like inside of you that you just can't get at, and it's just like just above the surface at all times. But then of course, in contrast to that, I'm loving some of these pieces. We're going to play a piece by Peter's Vasks. I may be mispronouncing his first name, but Vasks. And it's called Episode. And it has just, again, he just creates these incredible atmospheres, and then suddenly he just brings it all down to earth, and it's just right here with you with the rhythm or whatever, with the depth of sound, the layering of sound. And I think I'm drawn to those sorts of things in music. And
So you touched on it just a minute ago about arranging pieces for trio, and I was just amazed when I went to your website and I saw that you sell the sheet music for your arrangements. Were you already each of you arrangers slash composers, or is that something that you got into after you formed?
Julia and I had done a lot of it actually through Ensemble Connect, the program that she mentioned at Carnegie Hall, and that's a really cool program because you have um, like a small, normally proportioned cohort of like strings and winds and some brass. Like you have good a few string quartets in there. But the groups that we would play for in community settings, like I had a group that was like piano, trumpet, French horn, and bassoon. And that's like a totally random quartet, but it's like you can do a lot of stuff with that. And so I did a lot of arranging for that. And I know Julia played in a group that also did a bunch of arrangements. Um, but yeah, I think it was more for in terms of like arranging for a trio. Our first arrangements were actually for the Concert Artists Guild competition because we were like, we need something better than just like trio repertoire, which is amazing. Trio repertoire is so good, but it's also so limiting to pieces that are generally, like 30 minutes long in four movements. And how do you get some variety of what's going on in the programming? A lot of the short pieces for trio are not that good. And so we kind of reached out into art song and piano and orchestral repertoire for that.
And historically, that's the way concerts used to be, right? They would play one piece and some arrangements.
Yes.
Um, yeah. Well, I think it's really great, and I think our audience will really enjoy it for sure. Um, so I'm gonna shift gears just a little bit because this is a question I generally start off with, and everybody who's on the show gets asked this question. But it's the number one question I think our audience members have, those who are not musicians themselves, is how do you become a classical musician? So the question is, what is your earliest musical memory?
Um, Mine is hearing fiddle playing. Um, I started Irish dancing because my mother is Irish, and she took me along when I was very little to my first class. And um, you know, in Irish music, the fiddle is really important. So I remember the feeling of actually hearing people's feet um, in a pub in a pub in Melbourne in Australia, and there was a lot of cigarette smoke in the air, a lot of elderly men drinking Guinness, and there was a lot of noise. And I heard the sound of this music, and it was fiddle playing, live fiddle, and I just thought that was really something. I just had that in my mind for so long then, and I kept asking and asking if I could play.
Mm.
I actually, one of my first musical memories is of chamber music. And I distinctly remember sitting in this living room that the three of us have now played in a few times as a trio, my Uncle Joel's living room over near Worcester, Massachusetts, and we had been visiting for Thanksgiving, and he's an amateur pianist, and my cousins played flute and cello, and so they would, play trios sometimes. And apparently, I asked my parents for a piano like directly after hearing them. I remembered the living room and the music that happened there, but I think I was like 3 or 4, so I don't remember asking for the piano, but maybe that was their way of sneaking it in.
There's always this origin story.
Yeah.
I think for me, my earliest musical memory is just so my mom is a lovely pianist, and so she would play for our church every week, and I would always hear her on Sunday mornings as she's warming up. with her scales and a couple hymns, and those memories are very, I just remember them throughout my childhood. But I think as soon as I was able to play the cello, I was 6 years old, and I was so excited about it because my sister actually started first. And I think this was one of the ways that my mom was getting me excited about it, because she really wanted me to play the cello too. But I think I really was very excited about it, like as soon as I started playing, because there are like pictures and home videos of like we would have guests over for dinner in the dining room, and then like inevitably I would come and bring my chair with my cello and start like playing my piece for them. Very enthusiastic young cellist.
That's pretty funny. I can really picture that one. We have a home video of my sons, who will remain nameless. But one of them turns to the camera, and he has his violin and his bow in his hand, and he says, "Come see some things that I can do." Which is very cute. So if you don't mind telling me a little about how about your particular instrument, like the piano that I see behind you. How did you come by that piano? Is it borrowed? Do you own it? You certainly don't travel with it.
No, actually, I'm sitting in our rehearsal room. Um, and so this is my living room, and you might notice it's a very small piano. It's actually a digital piano. Um, it's a very excellent digital hybrid made by Yamaha, and what it has inside of it is like a bunch of lasers that detect the exact like touch and the way that the hammers are striking, except that they're not striking strings. They strike against like just a piece of metal, and inside it is also like the sampled sound of a Yamaha concert grand. So it actually has a very like deep bass and kind of like full sound, more similar to what we would get for a concert grand. The sound fidelity is obviously not an acoustic instrument. It's not that good. Um, but believe it or not, you can rehearse the piano trio with it.
And it feels right. The touch feels okay, huh?
Yeah, the touch is good. So it was actually I got this instrument on the day that Boston locked down in 2020 because I didn't have an instrument to practice on at home, and I'm renting it. I made several calls that day because I was desperate and I knew I needed a piano, and it's held up. So this is what I'm playing on.
We'll go to Julia next.
Yeah. Well, I've been playing my cello for quite a while. Actually, I think I started playing it in my early teen years. And between then and now, I've played a number of other cellos for different periods of time that were on loan to me or whatnot. And I always end up coming back to this one. It's a French cello from around 1860. It's a Cossin, and his pet name is Jacques. But lovely,
It's a
lovely.
male cello.
Here's Jacques on Saturday.
Bridget?
I'm actually in the process of looking for a new violin right now. And I just picked up in San Francisco on Sunday a really lovely violin from 1723 from Ferrara. It's a Mezzadri, and I'm very excited about it.
Okay.
It's very beautiful. So Saturday will be my first experience playing it in a larger space than Lee's living room, and we'll see how it goes.
A test run.
Yeah, test run.
That's pretty cool.
Hmm.
I want to find out a little more about your mentors, the important teachers and mentors for you as a group, but maybe also individually. Because I know you were at NEC in the special professional trio program. I imagine you had really wonderful mentors there, but you may have had mentors that shaped you along the way earlier?
As a trio, but I just say this also as a pianist because she's my teacher. Our main coach at NEC was Vivian Weilerstein. So I only started studying with her, when we came here. So I was already 29 or something. Had been out of school for many years already and kind of past the point where I assumed I would still be taking lessons. And she completely transformed my playing, but she also completely transformed the group and our sound and you know, just how we think about playing together. I think she's one of the most amazing teachers out there, most amazing musicians out there that I know. Um, and it's funny, um, because like in this program that Julia and I were in, sorry, I keep coming back to it. We did a lot of teaching in public schools, teaching artist work. And I mean, that's often where you bring in something creative for just like one class a week to a music classroom, that sort of thing. And one of the things they told us was that, like teaching is 80% just who you are. It's just your personality and what you bring into the room. And I've thought about that a lot. And I do think that one of my most influential teachers was Patricia Zander, who was my high school music teacher. She's also such a beautifully sensitive chamber musician. She played with Yo-Yo Ma in a duo for a long time. And I remember she was really excited when I got into Yale for literature because she didn't think I should be a pianist at the time. This is also a theme of like teachers that I've had, but but I just but it's so telling in a funny way because what I loved about going to her lessons like Friday afternoons at 5 was that she would always have like some beautiful Indian curry cooking on the stove and then have like these amazing bookshelves and always be like reading something from it that she would talk to me about. And I remember just being so just like steeped in it and inspired by the whole experience of playing for her, not just the teaching.
Having the cooking going on at the same time. Yeah. One of my son's violin teachers used to stop and make him spaghetti in the middle of the lesson.
I love that. You need food for the soul.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess for me, I mean, I think first of all, that I feel that I owe so much to each of my teachers and what they've given and what they've brought to their teaching. And one particular teacher that I think was one of the big reasons that I decided to really stick with music and major in music as well was Hans Jürgen Jensen.
Mhm.
And he's at Meadowmount and at Northwestern University. And speaking of like 80% of your being the most influential, he's just a crazy like human being, but so inspiring. And I think all of his students would say that the thing that he brings perhaps most strongly to the table is just this sense of inspiration and this motivation to love your instrument and to figure things out about it, um, and just some sort of, I don't know, he awoke some sort of flame inside of me that I think that I had as a child, but he really brought it to life even more.
Yeah, and yeah, I would say, there were many people at NEC who were really gave us a lot in terms of how to think about the art of trio playing, which, is its own specific thing and is probably not spoken of as much as, say, quartet playing might be. And one of our coaches and the person who was also my violin teacher was Don Weilerstein, and he's really amazing, really incredible person, and extremely extremely humble in his own relationship with learning and with music. And he's taught for so long now, and he's lived a very full life in many ways, but he always comes into a lesson and has learned something new that he's very eager to share with you. And I think that was very inspiring, that a teacher isn't somebody who has all the answers, but a teacher is somebody who can really ignite in you also a real curiosity and a desire to just inquire more always. And that's an endeavor that never stops.
So it's a shared journey that you're taking with your teacher.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, that's a really interesting thing to think about. Um, so I want to give our audience a chance to ask some questions, and I see there's one question in the Q&A. It is the repertoire for a piano trio less expansive in scope or period than for a string quartet?
Um, Not particularly. It's less prolific. So for instance, Beethoven has, sorry, I always forget this, is it 16 string quartets? 16 string quartets, and then I guess 7 trios, but there's like one or two odd things that might be counted as trios. You know, Bartok has 6 quartets and 0 trios. It's very sad. Um, but they're like the great trios by many of these composers from all of these different periods are really some of the best pieces that they wrote. So it's really on the same, it's at the same level of depth and sophistication and importance as the quartet repertoire, but it's a little less varied and yeah, I don't know. There's some interesting stuff. Some pieces we've started playing recently are Rameau pieces for harpsichord in concert with string instruments, which are incredibly sophisticated pieces from the first half of the 18th century. So much more contrapuntally complex and rich and soloistic for the string parts than Haydn trios, for instance. So it's interesting. There are some, you can find some real gems from not the beaten track, but that's also true in string quartet. Purcell like consorts for four viols are also incredible. So
Mhm.
But one lovely thing actually about trios often is that because there are only three people involved, often the trio has been written with particular performers in mind. So, for example, one lovely thing that we've been experienced recently has been playing some late Haydn trios from his time in London, and he writes them for this really amazing German pianist, Therese Janssen, who also happens to be in London at the time. And I think that that's a really special experience as a performer in the 21st century, that you're playing this work that's written, for somebody's hands. And it speaks directly to this person's ability, to their musicianship, to even their particular taste in what they like. And I think that can be really, really amazing to feel like you have this direct line of communication with this person and with the composer and just with this other time and other way of making music.
That's
it,
really fascinating.
yeah, famously, a lot of Beethoven's works, right, are dedicated to the Archduke Rudolph, his patron, so including the Archduke Trio. But the triple concerto was also composed for him to have a concerto, but he wasn't the pianist that Beethoven was. So the funny thing about the triple concerto is there was a really cracked cellist, and it's basically like the cello writing is like some of the hardest stuff written in that period, and the piano part's not that bad.
That's very funny. So how much time are you guys on the road these days? I mean, it's COVID and all, but is it a lot?
Yeah, it's varied. This season has definitely ramped up quite a bit. I think in the next 4 or 5 weeks we have 8 concerts in 5 different places. So it'll be quite busy for the next few weeks. But then I think on average we'll have a concert a weekend or so during the season, or 3 to 4 concerts per month, something like that. Would you say that's true? And I mean, the other thing is, as we were talking about, we have several of these projects. So if there's a period of perhaps 2 weeks where we don't have a booking for a concert, we'll have some sort of project or residency in Yellow Barn where we're working for 10 days, or rehearsing with John in New York for about a week before our Merkin concert, where we're doing Undiluted Days in March. So it ends up being pretty full, feeling quite full enough.
And since you're all in the same city, do you practice a lot together when you're not touring? Um,
Yeah, it's a lot less than we used to, but it's still a lot. I mean, yeah, we've been rehearsing 3 hours a day this week, and that's pretty typical, I think. We do about 5 days a week. Try not to do weekends, but then weekends are concerts, so it's a lot of days.
so, so it's a lot of playing. I suppose you have to be very organized, plan it all out. Um, are you all organized, or is does one of you take on that role more than the others?
There's too much to do. If we didn't all do it, nothing would get done. So we're all organized for each other, I think.
So I notice it is 7:51, and I want to ask the audience who's here tonight, if you have any questions you want to ask, you can um, type it in the Q&A, um, or Shay, who is working behind the scenes, can promote you to a panelist so that you can turn your video on and unmute. I'll give you a couple of minutes here to decide which way you want to go. Um, and while you're thinking about this, the last question I like to ask, and I ask everybody this question because it's something I think about a lot. What do you think the role is of an artist today in the world? Is this something that you think about for yourselves? Like, what is my role in the world? What are my goals as an artist citizen? I suppose you do think about this a lot, because that's sort of what this whole Ensemble Connect program is about. Um,
This is not something I've reflected on a lot in the last year. But maybe because of that, I feel like I have kind of a radical idea of what this means to me personally, which is that I really think that being an artist in the world today is being human, kind of against the odds, because I feel like we have so many ways in which not really being human is increasingly normalized. Like whether it's our relationship with technology, our relationship with work. I feel like we're being asked to like push ourselves and adapt to this world so much of the time that, it's like it's a future that we obviously all want to make sense of together. But I think the definition of what it means to be human is changing. And I think that so much of at least in the kind of art that we do, which is, very different from being like an artist who's very grounded in like contemporary life and media. But, for us, it's about connecting with this past where, the way people experienced music or poetry and the way that you're all experiencing it like this weekend is increasingly not the norm, just to actually be able to sit and listen to something for like an hour and a half. And I think uh, constructing your life in such a way that allows you to rehearse for that and make the kind of sacrifices necessary to spend your time in that way is, I think, a different sort of lifestyle that is kind of like endangered increasingly in this world. So maybe that's a very intense response, also just coming from like living through the pandemic as an artist, but that's kind of how I feel about it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, during the last 2 years, it can be very difficult at moments not to feel like it's an incredibly selfish pursuit, because you aren't, you spend so much time just with the three of us, or even on our own, just practicing and playing, and you're thinking about sometime in the 19th century, generally, in a country and that was, not prioritizing the kinds of things that we might prioritize nowadays. So yeah, I think it's very easy to sort of fall into a hole of, I'm not quite sure of the purpose of this, but one thing that I think, Lee touched upon is certainly since coming back to live performance, I think that actually musicians and the experience of live music in a space together can offer something that is just so important sort of to the matter of living, because it really demands that you bring yourself into relationship with one another, with the audience, with the musicians, but crucially also with an idea of time. The kinds of like demands that our linear idea of time makes of us in our everyday are completely suspended because music operates often in very different ways. And it also really demands that you have a relationship with history. And that's one thing that's really come up in the last 18 months or so. I think a lot of musicians have had to really think, very clearly, perhaps for the first time, well, why do I just play music from the 19th century? What is my relationship with that? And if I choose to do that and I choose to bring that into my present, then I have to really engage with it in more than just a passive way. Because musicians are human beings and we live in a world, and our choices matter. So I think that for all of those reasons, for me, increasingly the act of playing, it becomes almost like a a philosophical statement about how you understand time working, how you understand how history is constructed and created, and those stories are told. So that makes it, worthwhile for me.
I think also for me, I totally agree actually with what Lee and Bridget are saying, but our particular field of classical music is often the job is to be sharing voices, sharing others people's voices. And I mean, this could go in a lot of different directions, but I think it's this process of sharing that's like the actual process of sharing itself is so powerful. And we found that again in these live performances. For myself, in our first concert that we played together, I mean, I was moved to tears when I was playing with them. I was like, I shouldn't be moved to tears. Like, but actually, even as we've been playing a number of concerts on the road, and sometimes you play a concert and you're not in this emotional space to maybe feel as if you're feeling every emotion that you should be feeling, but then you talk to an audience member afterwards and perhaps they're weeping, and you understand that actually, again, you're sharing this composer's feelings of emotion or longing or sadness or pain. And I think that's so powerful. Like that's such a power that comes through music and through classical music. And of course, there's the question of whose voices are we sharing? And I think that's also the responsibility of artists from all periods, but especially today as we're grappling with these questions.
So we have a question in the Q&A. So Bridget, you mentioned that there were some real lows as the group started. What were some of the highs?
I love it. This is very American. We start with the glass half full. Sorry, I brought the English into this conversation. That's the glass half empty. Some of the highs, well, I mean, getting to play, it was lots of fun. We had a lot of fun in rehearsal. We got to take some trips together, which was, I'm not from this country, so I always enjoy seeing new place and getting to speak to people. And it was pre-pandemic, so we got to speak to people after, and it was a sense of freedom. And just the feeling of possibility and things growing. I mean, I think it's also true to say that things didn't start clicking in a musical way, and certainly not in a way that anybody else recognized until like 18 months in. And that's a really great lesson in patience, that you can be, you can feel like you've done all your training and you've got to a certain place individually, but you have to really put all of that ego aside when you start something new and say, well, listen, I haven't really played a lot of trios, and I have to take the time to learn, and I have to know that it's not going to be easy, no matter how experienced I am. And it, I really have to learn how these other people play, and I have to learn how we can play together, and also try and get on the same page in terms of what are our collective ideals in terms of sound, and how do we make this work in a way that actually speaks to people, because ultimately it's not really about us and what happens in the rehearsal room, but it's about what happens on stage and whether that communicates anything.
Mhm. So I notice it is 8 o'clock, which brings our evening to a close, but I want to thank you for joining us. Thank you for your generous time and being willing to answer our questions this evening. And I really can't wait to see you in person. And I can't wait for the audience to see you in person. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
We're
Jennifer.
so excited too. Yeah. Thank you, Jennifer.
Very excited for Saturday.
Well, is it your first time in Albany?
Yes,
Will be, yeah.
definitely for me.
So hopefully it won't be too cold on on Saturday. We had 5 degrees earlier this week.
Brigid's frantically converting to Celsius.
Yeah, exactly. What does that mean? What does that mean?
It's minus 15
Oh god,
Celsius, something like that.
I'm not in Kansas anymore.
Not in Kansas anymore. Well, maybe you are. Kansas is cold too.
Yeah, but yeah.
Well, thank you so much and have a good night.
You
Bye
too.
bye.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Jennifer.
Take care.
You too.